Snow and wind had already shut down every other regional airport by the time Flight 227 from Minneapolis wobbled onto the ice-striped runway of Mossstone Field, a lonely airstrip that looked, from above, like a postcard someone had forgotten to mail. Calliope Wren, 29, bright-haired and shivering inside a coat designed for kinder winters, stumbled down the metal stairs into a horizontal avalanche of sleet. She carried three things: a dented suitcase plastered with birdwatching stickers, a leather field journal that smelled faintly of pine resin, and a letter of invitation from the Old Tide Inn's winter writer's residency, promising quiet, sea-salted solitude for the serious naturalist. The cyclone named Cassandra had other plans. It hissed in her ears, stole her breath, and flung neon airport lights into mad, swirling halos. Baggage handlers in plastic ponchos skated across black ice, hurling luggage toward a rattling cart. When her own suitcase finally crashed into the pile, a brusque coordinator thrust a bundle of keys into her gloved hand with the efficiency of someone racing a storm clock. The brass tag said 3M in a curlicue font that looked older than the state of Minnesota itself. Behind it swung a translucent swipe card she barely registered before shoving both into her pocket. An hour later, after a harrowing shuttle ride down coast roads that alternated between snow tunnels and sudden cliffside vistas, the Old Tide Inn appeared, three crooked gables, a string of sputtering fairy lights, and the hum of an emergency generator that flickered like a dying bee. Inside, ancient floorboards groaned beneath an onslaught of stranded travelers, festival volunteers, and fisherfolk whose boats had been iced into the harbor. Someone thrust a mug of cinnamon-laced cocoa at Calliope. Someone else apologized that the elevators were out and pointed her toward a spiral staircase painted the color of seawater. She climbed, suitcase banging her shins, heart thudding from altitude and adrenaline. The third-floor corridor curved like the inside of a seashell, its windows rattling under gusts powerful enough to tilt portraits on the walls. A housekeeping cart stood abandoned, linen sheets fanning out like surrendered flags. At the far end, the door labeled 3M waited, keyhole glinting. It opened without resistance. Too easily, she thought in hindsight. And warm lamplight spilled over a room so extravagantly wrong that her breath stopped. Instead of the Spartan single she expected, she found a suite done in storm glass blues and champagne gold. Fireplace stacked with driftwood, velvet wingback chairs, and a small round table set with two slender candles. Sea silk ribbons trailed from the chandelier, their ends clipped with silver charms shaped like bioluminescent plankton. The smell was moon orchids and salt. And at the exact center of that table, on a cushion of winter white satin, lay a ring whose opal glowed with faint, impossible light, each color pulse echoing the distant boom of waves outside. Beside it rested a robin egg blue folder, the county seal embossed in copper leaf. She touched it before she thought to question it, flipped the cover with numb fingers, and stared at a document printed in looping black script. Marriage license, State of Blackstone, County of North Coast, Calliope Wren and Carver Home. For 3 full heartbeats, the world contracted to the ticking of a mantel clock and the frantic catalog of her own name. First, middle that no one used. Last, that still felt like borrowed confidence. Shock shredded the logical part of her brain. She had never heard of a Carver Home. But professional curiosity, that reflex that made her chase rare birds through marshes at dawn, snapped into place. She noticed the issuer's signature, the notary's stamp, the blank where a ceremony date should go. She noticed that the fireplace contained no ash and the candles were fresh, unlit, as though everything waited for her. She noticed finally that the door had drifted closed behind her and latched with a soft, ominous click. Panic would have been reasonable, yet something wilder rose instead. The unmistakable thrill of standing on the verge of an extraordinary story. She let the suitcase slide to the rug and took a slow orbit around the suite, hunting for context. Balloons, cameras, a prankster best friend with a terrible sense of timing. But the only sound was the storm outside, and, from the harbor below, the distant brassy swell of a marching band rehearsing scales. A festival, the residency packet had mentioned, something about glowing tides and midwinter folklore. Perhaps she had stumbled into a theme room set aside for newlyweds attending the celebration. Perhaps the clerk downstairs, harried and half-frozen, had misread her reservation. Or perhaps the universe itself had elbowed her gently off script. She pulled out her phone to call the front desk, but there was no signal, only the endless buffering wheel. Outside the frosted window, snow whirled beneath sodium lamps and hypnotic spirals, and beyond that, the unseen sea roared like a giant throat clearing. For the first time since touchdown, she laughed, a single incredulous burst that fogged the glass. Wrong key, she told the wind, and the wind naturally did not care. She looked again at the ring, at the folder with her name entwined forever with a stranger's, and felt the story unspool ahead of her like a ribbon dragged by the tide. Somewhere in the hotel, Carver home must exist. A man perhaps equally confused, perhaps expecting someone entirely different. The sensible thing would be to march back downstairs, demand clarification, and secure the modest third-floor single actually assigned to her. Yet the sweet smelled of orchids and possibility, and the storm slammed against the panes as though to seal the doors of the world. Calliope Wren, veteran tracker of rare phenomena, chose curiosity over caution. She tucked the folder under her arm, pocketed the key, and resolved to find this Carver home. After all, he owed her an explanation, and she owed herself the next wild chapter of a night already burning brighter than bioluminescent surf. By the time Calliope reached the lobby, the old Tide Inn looked less like a hotel and more like the backstage of a traveling circus. Brass instruments blared scales that ricocheted off timbered walls. Boxes of coil-shaped fireworks lay stacked beside hunting nets, and a dozen volunteers in oilskin jackets threaded garlands of luminous sea glass through the rafters while shouting. Jokes in three overlapping dialects. Slender banners the color of electric mint bore the stylized crest of the Noctiluca Festival, two hands cupping a ribbon of glowing water, and every few minutes a gust howled through the revolving doors, showering the tile with fresh snow that attendants swept away before it had time to melt. Calliope, clutching the blue folder against her ribs, tried twice to flag down the concierge, but the woman disappeared behind a procession of drummers, then re-emerged waving an armful of battery packs at a maintenance crew and vanished again. Somewhere above this chaos, a bell tolled the quarter hour. It was already 8:30, and midnight, the legendary moment when the harbor would ignite with living light, felt suddenly near and inevitable. She threaded her way toward the bar, intending to wait out the storm with a consolatory drink before demanding her room. Yet the bartender was engaged in a heated debate with a fisherman about whether bioluminescence offended the dignity of traditional trawl nets, and nobody seemed inclined to notice a newcomer waving an ID card. At the far end of the counter, an elderly woman in a chartreuse shawl beckoned Calliope closer, eyes sparkling above a teacup that smelled of rum and cloves. "You're the bride, aren't you?" she asked with the confidence of someone repeating a fact, not a question. When Calliope stammered that she most certainly was not, the woman chuckled, patted her wrist, and said, "The key never lies, dear. Room 3M is reserved for the festival vow. If the sea placed you there, the sea will see you through." Then, with the timing of a stage illusion, she produced a clutch of corsages from her shawl, tiny orchids wired to glow faintly blue, and pressed one into Calliope's palm before drifting off, into the crowd, leaving behind the scent of storms and strange decision. Calliope considered retreating to the stairs, but the lobby's glass doors banged open, and a column of musicians swept into the room chasing a blast of frigid air. Trumpets, sousaphones, snare drums, even a battered glockenspiel, all blaring a Celtic march whose tempo accelerated as they circled the bar and turned the lounge into an improvised parade ground. Festival stewards urged guests into loose lines and passed around lanterns shaped like jellyfish. On impulse, Calliope let herself be nudged forward, folder still clutched to her coat, her mind insisting she was merely observing cultural pageantry for future writing. A young steward with a clipboard paused in front of her, long enough to pin a satin ribbon across her shoulder that read, "Processional 3" before vanishing into the throng. She tried to remove it, but the knot proved cunningly tight. The doors flew open a second time, admitting a swirl of snowflakes and a figure who momentarily silenced even the brass. He was tall, lean in the way of people who spend months at sea, hair soaked to a darker shade by melting ice, parka fur rimmed with frost. Across his cheek, a fresh cut bloomed crimson, like a faulty tide gauge, and in one gloved hand he held a nautical duffel that clanged with equipment. He surveyed the bedlam with the expression of a man returning to find his house repurposed as a carnival. mouth shaping a single incredulous word. Really? Then his gaze snagged on Calliope's ribbon. Their eyes locked, and in that instant recognition flared. Not of each other, but of the impossible circumstance linking them. She saw the same blue folder tucked under his arm, her own name printed on its flap beside his, and all the sound in the lobby flattened to a dizzying heartbeat pulse. He approached with careful steps, as though fearing the floor might give way beneath so much coincidence. "I'm Carver Home," he said, voice raw from wind exposure, "and I think we should talk about paperwork." Calliope introduced herself in a tone that would have suited the discovery of a previously unknown crater on Mars. She expected confusion, perhaps annoyance, but Carver exhaled a short laugh that carried both disbelief and a hint of relief. "I was told my intended would be a last-minute arrival," he admitted, wiping snowmelt from his brow. Apparently that wasn't a metaphor. Before she could answer, a paunchy man in a velvet waistcoat slammed a ceremonial staff on the floor, barking orders for couples to proceed through the south doors in bonding sequence. A hush, bright with anticipation, fell over the assembly. Calliope grabbed Carver's sleeve and whispered that she had no intention of marrying a stranger and that a monumental mix-up required immediate correction, but the staff-bearer snapped his fingers at them, misreading their urgency as eagerness, and stewards shepherded them into a corridor strung with luminescent ribbons. The sheer momentum of the procession drove them onward, past a cloakroom where anxious brides repinned updos and grooms compared notes on last-minute vows. Carver muttered that the festival had resurrected a 19th century maritime tradition. Sailors betrothed on the eve of departure would pledge themselves under the glow tide, so that, should they be lost at sea, the ocean would still carry their vows home. "Romantic, but borderline coercive," he added as they reached a pair of French doors that opened onto the frozen boardwalk. Outside, the world belonged to ice and music. Lanterns bobbed along the pier, each releasing ripples of teal light that stained the snowdrifts, while overhead a canopy of storm clouds flickered sporadically with sheet lightning. A brass choir took up a slow hymn in a minor key, the notes half lost to wind. The wedding officiant, a willowy notary named Sybil Danway, wearing a coat that sparkled like fish scales, stood at the pier's end beside a lectern carved from driftwood. Behind her the harbor lay dark, but under the surface thousands of dormant plankton waited to blaze at the stroke of 12 like submerged constellations. Calliope's rational voice demanded she step aside, but her scientist's curiosity insisted she witness what happened next, and her storyteller's pulse whispered that you did not walk away from the heart of a folkloric engine moments before it roared to life. She and Carver, as the couple designated Processional 3, were guided to a platform framed by ropes of warm amber bulbs. Their breath mingled in the air, visible proof of shared bewilderment. He leaned close enough that she could smell sea salt and diesel on his coat and murmured, "On my honor, we'll sign nothing irreversible." She nodded, gripping the blue folder so tightly the edges cut her palm. Sybil Danway raised a quartz pocket watch, its face luminous, and announced to the wind that 11:59 had arrived. All conversation ceased. Even the storm seemed to pause, listening. She instructed Calliope and Carver to place their right hands over a shallow basin filled with seawater, rippling with latent blue sparks. "This is purely symbolic," Sybil assured them, "a promise to honor the living ocean that cradles our town." Calliope extended her hand, noticing a tremor she refused to name fear, and felt Carver's knuckles brush hers above the basin. A fleeting contact, but enough to send an electric jolt of solidarity up her arm. The clock ticked. With each second, the water in the harbor appeared to inhale, shadows shifting under the ice. 12 chimes rang from the town's stone bell tower, deep and resonant, and on the final stroke the sea answered. Waves under the pier erupted into sheets of color, brilliant aquamarine that raced across the surface like wildfire through a field of wheat. Gasps and cheers rippled along the crowd. The basin between their hands flared, bathing their skin in living sapphire. Sybil's clear voice carried over the roar. "By tide and time, witness the covenant of Calliope Wren and Carver Home." A spontaneous chorus of horns and shouts drowned whatever words followed. Confetti cannons burst overhead, releasing clouds of phosphorescent petals that clung to wool and hair like friendly starlight. In that gleaming chaos, paperwork felt obsolete, even absurd. Yet Calliope's mind kept perfect count of every surreal detail. The angle of Carver's half-smile, the reflected bioluminescence dancing in his dark eyes, the odd assurance that they were both actors and audience to a myth reenacting itself through them. Somewhere people pressed rings into their palms, silver for him, opal for her, and she realized with a shock of clarity that the ring from the suite had been meant for this precise moment. Carver, all ironic bravado gone, whispered that they could pretend, then run. She whispered back that she would prefer to run after, not before, because some stories had to be finished to discover whether they were tragedies or miracles. Sybil lifted their joined hands to the roar of clapping, then invited the newly united couples to follow the lantern bearers down the ice stairs toward waiting boats for the ceremonial harbor circuit. Calliope and Carver moved as though spellbound through the jubilant crush, their coats dusted with pale fire. Below the pier, the water glowed so fiercely it seemed the moon itself had drowned for joy. Calliope thought she heard gulls echoing the hymn, though gulls slept at night, and thought she saw the snowflakes hesitate in midair, as if unwilling to fall into such light. On the deck of a small launch draped in netted emerald bulbs, she and Carver finally found a bubble of quiet. He exhaled, fogging the lantern between them, and said, eyes glittering, "Apologies for the haste, Miss Wren. I swear I usually buy dinner first." She laughed, sudden and unstoppable, because everything was too large for ordinary reactions, and replied that she charged extra for spontaneous folklore, but might make an exception if he could explain why the sea had chosen them. All around, the harbor shone like a turquoise mirror, broken into a million undulating shards, and the other boats formed a slow orbit, each bearing couples radiant as ghost stories come to life. The night smelled of salt and winter roses, and beneath the crackle of distant fireworks, Calliope heard a deeper music, the hush of tides turning the pages of an old tale that now carried her name. Whatever dawn held, it would find her with a stranger who was no longer entirely a stranger, bound by a myth she had stepped into without planning, riding a current neither of them yet understood. And in her pocket, the marriage license pulsed like a hidden ember, waiting to decide whether it was an absurd bureaucratic error or the first line of a destiny too luminous to refuse. The room was still awash in the bruised violet of pre-dawn when Calliope surfaced from a sleep too shallow to deserve the name, the muffled boom of distant waves threading itself through her dream and into waking reality. A banked fire threw low amber light across velvet curtains, and above the mantel, the clock she had admired only hours earlier now ticked with a smug inevitability she found almost insulting. For several disoriented heartbeats she rehearsed the previous night, checking it for cracks the way a geologist taps at stone. The swirl of musicians, the roaring harbor, Carver's steady hand over hers, a ring that glimmered whenever lantern light caught the opal's shifting blue heart. That ring was still there, cool against her skin, refusing to slide past a knuckle swollen from cold and salt, as though the metal had already memorized her pulse and taken a private vow to stay. She tried to sit, discovered that every muscle in her spine objected, and finally noticed the soft snore coming from the armchair opposite the bed. Carver home, boots off but still wearing the salt-stained thermal shirt and cargo pants of last night's chaos, had sprawled sideways with a fleece blanket over him, a mug balanced precariously on the side table. Someone, likely him, had brewed something herbal and pungent. The steam still rose in lazy ribbons, fogging the reading glasses he had dropped nearby. Calliope's first irrational thought was that he looked comfortable, as if the universe had only shuffled its deck to place him exactly here. Her second, more practical thought was that they needed answers before daylight fully conquered the storm. She swung her legs over the edge of the mattress and padded across a rug patterned with faded compass roses, half expecting the room to evaporate like a mirage once she left the bed. The blue folder lay on the fireplace hearth where she must have tossed it after their return. No, after their retreat from the festival. She crouched, opened it, and found a second sheet she had not seen. The officiant's certification already stamped in crimson ink with the county seal. Sybil Danway had worked quickly. The date read the 18th, the time a neat 07, and two signatures sprawled in fountain pen flourishes beneath. Carver's name was legible, naval, and direct. Hers was embarrassingly ornate, the sort of autograph one used when asked by a child at a book fair. Evidence in black and red that she and a man she had met roughly 4 hours earlier were, to all municipal purposes, married. The kettle clicked off in a corner kitchenette, startling her so badly the folder nearly slipped. Carver was awake, hair sticking up like beach grass after a gale, one eyebrow raised in wary greeting. He watched her for a moment, inventorying her like a field scientist. "Morning," he said, voice rough as gravel. "I made cedar tip tea. No caffeine, but it'll keep the cold out." He did not glance at the paperwork. She realized he already knew its contents. Instead, he poured 2 cups, handed one to her, and leaned back against the counter as though discussing weather patterns. "First things first," he continued. "Sybil filed that license before we left the dock. Barring catastrophic clerical error, we are legally bound in the eyes of Blackstone County and, by extension, the state." Calliope drank, flavors of pine and lemon balm scalding her tongue, and felt every cell in her body demand a plan. "Annulment," she said carefully, testing the word like an unfamiliar tool. Carver nodded. "There's a 90-day window for filing. Judge Plutarch Bain in St. Lazarus handles them. Simple petition, no fault. Though he does ask awkward questions about intent and capacity." He set his cup down with a gentle thunk. "Unfortunately," he moved to the window, drew back a curtain, and revealed a world sealed in white silence. Overnight, the blizzard had redoubled. Dunes of snow buried the garden lamps, and the access road to Highway 18 was a single undulating drift. Town's snowplow broke an axle at 3 a.m. Harbors iced in. No ferries, no buses, no way out until at least tomorrow if the forecast kind. Electricity's on backup generator. Cell towers are intermittent. He turned, expression somewhere between apology and amusement. "Looks like we're stuck." Across the room her phone buzzed, then died, then buzzed again in a fitful dance. She caught a flash of notifications. Her editor demanding a rewrite on a deadline she had blown spectacularly. A series of incredulous texts from her sister. Screenshots of local news headlines reading, "Midnight Miracle Marriage at Noctiluca Festival," and a half-dozen social media tags from strangers posting blurry footage of her and Carver bathed in blue fire. The internet had done what it always did. Spun legend from rumor at the speed of boredom. She muted the device, slid it into her journal for psychological distance, and faced Carver with a resolve that felt equal parts courage and sheer professional curiosity. "If we can't leave, we can at least gather data," she said. "Find out what we signed, who can reverse it, whether the festival has a contingency for accidental couples." He gave her a grin that dulled the edge of panic. "I like how you say accidental couples as if we're a classification of dragonfly." The grin softened. "I'm sorry, Calliope. None of this was my plan either. My crew thought it would be hilarious to file the paperwork early, claim it was all in good fun, and surprise me with a staged ceremony once I came off the research vessel. They just neglected to hire the correct bride, it seems." At that he rubbed the bridge of his nose, embarrassment coloring his cheeks. She felt the impulse to reassure him, the same reflex she used on skittish nestlings, so she changed the subject. They spent the next hour constructing a war room at the round table. Laptops tethered to a sputtering network repeater, spiral notebooks, and the inn's landline patched directly to the courthouse's automated system, which droned that all clerks would be unavailable due to inclement weather. Outside, guests sloshed through hallways, returning from hangovers and honeymoon suites. Somewhere someone played a battered accordion, and the sad, sweet refrain spilled under the door like seawater. As sunlight brightened, Calliope and Carver discovered they shared a terrifyingly efficient work rhythm. He printed relevant statutes from a cached legal archive. She highlighted witness requirements and deadline clauses, their hands brushing as they traded pages. Between citations, they exchanged thumbnail biographies. She described her upcoming field study on albino hummingbirds in the Yucatan. He explained his research on peptide emissive proteins in deep-sea crustaceans. Each revelation felt like a stone skipping toward the other shore, closing distance incrementally yet irreversibly. Around noon, the generator hiccuped, lights blinking out long enough to silence conversation in every room of the inn. They paused, listening to the wind-battered cedar shingles. Calliope's stomach growled, and without comment, Carver scavenged the minibar. Oat biscuits, local honey, a tin of smoked herring. They ate picnic-style on the carpet, knees almost touching, and she discovered that laughter still lived in her chest when he tried to pronounce Latin species names with a mouthful of biscuit and failed spectacularly. She told him about the first time she'd held a peregrine chick, how its heartbeat felt like thunder trapped in cotton, and he admitted that nothing he'd seen in the abyssal plain matched the terror of presenting at his doctoral defense. The conversation swelled, receded, surged again, as natural and unpredictable as surf. Late afternoon brought a knock. Evlampia McBride, the concierge, bundled in maroon wool and smelling of peppermints, informed them that the county registrar had confirmed receipt of their license. "Congratulations again," she beamed, handing over a welcome basket of sea salt caramels and a voucher for breakfast in bed. Calliope managed a polite nod. Carver attempted a protest, but Evlampia had already vanished into a corridor echoing with guests' delighted shrieks. Apparently someone had proposed on the grand staircase. The festival was making good on its reputation. They shuffled back inside, basket forgotten on the dresser, and stared at each other over the gulf between desire for autonomy and the gravitational pull of collective myth. An hour before dusk, the storm slackened, and a weak bronze light slid beneath the clouds, illuminating the harbor. From the suite's bay window, they watched the tide retreat, leaving behind a ragged sheen of lingering plankton that pulsed in time with the wash of waves. Carver, leaning one shoulder against the frame, said quietly, "There's a phenomenon called delayed luminescence, when organisms store photon energy and release it long after the original stimulus is gone. It's like the ocean remembers the night." Calliope folded her arms, considering the water's faint glow. "Maybe people have delayed reactions too," she replied. "Shock first, acceptance later. Or vice versa." Her breath clouded the glass. She traced an absent swirl that matched the shape of the bay. Evening closed in quickly, lights returning as the generator stabilized, and they found themselves back at the round table, staring at two neat stacks of paper, one labeled Petition for Annulment, the other Temporary Continuance Request. Carver drummed his fingers, thoughtful. "If the road's clear by dawn, we could drive south, file these, and be free by the weekend," he said. But his tone carried the hesitation of someone aware that freedom was not always synonymous with wisdom. Calliope set her pen down. "Let's file," she agreed. "But if we're postponing the C's decision, I'd like to understand why it made one at all. Tomorrow, when the snowplow digs us out, drive me to where you collect those glowing shrimp. Show me the lab, the coastline, the places that explain how your life ends up in festival vows." Surprise widened his eyes, then lit them. "Deal," he said, extending a hand. She took it, and their handshake felt less like a contract than a joint hypothesis demanding further study. Somewhere far below, the inn's boiler rattled, reminding them that the world was still mechanical, still capable of mundane failure. But here on the third floor, in a room that smelled faintly of moon orchids and cedar tea, two almost strangers mapped a narrow corridor between happenstance and intention. They were neither in love nor at war, neither captive nor entirely free, yet the peculiar balance of their circumstance offered something stranger than either: the possibility of choosing each other, even if only for the length of a storm. And for now, just for tonight, that possibility was enough to keep the opal on her finger glowing like a captured star and the fire crackling against the dark siege of winter outside. With dawn only a pale suggestion behind ragged cloud, the county Snowcutter finally roared past the old Tide Inn, throwing a glittering rooster tail over drift and driveway, and the change in sound woke Calliope from a doze she had taken fully clothed on top of the coverlet. Carver was already downstairs bartering for thermoses of soup and an extra can of diesel, and by the time she shrugged into her parka, he had backed a sea-green 1967 Studebaker manta ray up to the porch, engine idling with the low, satisfied purr of a predator that has located open water after days trapped under ice. The car smelled of leather polish and distant decades. Its fins and chrome seemed impossibly optimistic against the gray slab of winter sky. Yet tire chains hugged its rear wheels, and a weather-stained topo map lay spread across the hood as if bravado had been balanced by meticulous planning. They packed in efficient silence at first, her suitcase, his duffel, a cardboard box of survival gear McBride insisted they borrow, until cinnamon steam from a travel mug fogged Calliope's glasses and broke the spell. Carver explained the route, finger skating over the map. South along County 9 until it met Highway 18, then inland to St. Lazarus for the petition, and onward to his coastal lab if daylight and plows held. She listened, noting that he said if more often than when, a habit she recognized from field biologists who respected weather as a sentient rival. Just before they pulled away, she slipped the blue marriage folder into the glove box, neither hidden nor highlighted, a diplomatic placement that felt symbolic of everything unresolved between them. The first miles were a canyon of snow boulders, white walls taller than the car, but the sky lightened enough to reveal the sea on their right, frozen swells locked mid-curl against black basalt cliffs. He drove with steady hands, thumbs resting lightly at 10 and 2, and when the Studebaker crested drifts onto a clear stretch, he flicked on the radio, coaxing a crackly folk station out of hiding. The singer's voice wove through static like thread through coarse cloth, and Calliope found herself humming even before her brain registered melody. To keep boredom at bay, and perhaps to puncture the hush growing thick as insulation, Carver proposed a game called Unusual Fact, a volley of true statements with the rule that each must surprise the other. His opening serve landed decisively. He had once filmed a siphonophore colony longer than a blue whale calf, a ribbon of living lace that glowed crimson when sung to through the submersible hull. She countered by revealing she possessed one of only 7 verified photographs of an albino ruby-throated hummingbird in flight, and had convinced a skeptical editor by matching feather structure shadows to known specimens. They traded volleys, Carver's near drowning during an Antarctic katabatic wind event, Calliope's accidental discovery of a lichen species that fluoresced chartreuse under ultraviolet moonlight, until laughter filled the cab and the windshield seemed less like a barrier against cold than a theater screen of moving marvels. Around mid-morning, they stopped at a turnout overlooking the void where the river Gannet met the sea, though both were buried under armor-plated ice. Carver knelt to tighten the chains, his breath curling like smoke, while Calliope poured coffee into enamel cups that clinked softly when the wind shifted. She noticed a small scar just below his left ear, a pale crescent, and he caught her glance, explained it was from a misjudged dive angle at 16, an early lesson in the ocean's refusal to compromise. She told him the thin silver line across her knuckles came from a red-tailed hawk's talon the first time she'd tried banding raptors unsupervised. Those confessions felt minor compared with the legal bond ticking like a metronome in the glove box. Yet they forged a quiet fellowship of healed mistakes that no court stenographer would ever record. Back on the road, the clouds lowered, iron gray and sullen, and snow began again. Not wild but steady, the sort that accumulates by patience rather than fury. The folk station dissolved into white noise, so Carver switched to an old flash drive. Saxophone jazz filled the car, languid and warm. Calliope surprised them both by improvising a harmony, and he glanced over, eyebrows lifting as if he had discovered an unexpected aurora. They did not speak of futures or vows, but the music layered over tire hiss created a pocket in which time loosened its strict linearity, allowing possibility to stretch and breathe. Shortly after 2, an orange barricade and a state trooper's jeep blocked the highway fork where they planned to turn inland. A landslide, the trooper explained through a cracked window, had severed the northbound lane. Plows were rerouting traffic 20 miles back, but the detour would take hours, maybe a day, once crews blasted the heavier ice. Carver thanked him, retreated to the Studebaker, and spread the topo map on the steering wheel, tracing alternatives. One road snaked southeast along a decommissioned logging route, climbing into government forest where contour lines crowded together like whispered warnings. Halfway up that route, a faded dot marked a firewatch station built in the 50s. If they could reach the station, they might wait out the cleanup somewhere, with a stove and a roof stronger than laminated steel. He presented the option with the measured neutrality of a scientist proposing a high-risk protocol. Calliope studied the map, calculated daylight left, snow density, and the fact that fear often masquerades as logic. She nodded, not because risk evaporated, but because turning back promised only stagnation. They left the plowed highway, tires crunching over unprocessed snowfall, and entered a corridor of spruce whose boughs bent under heavy white like monks in contemplation. The Studebaker's heater fought valiantly. Frost still fanned across the rear quarter windows in paisley patterns. They spoke little, sensing the need for the driver's absolute concentration. Yet the silence was companionable rather than strained, stitched together by occasional field notes. Carver identifying an icefall plume, Calliope naming the greening bark of spruce chlorophyll awakening even in February. Mid-ascent, the car fishtailed on a hidden patch of glazed gravel, rocking sideways until Carver corrected with calm precision. The adrenaline that flooded Calliope's veins reminded her tongues of flame could exist inside snow. They stopped, shoveled packed ice from under the chains, and when the car finally lurched free, she found herself whooping, an involuntary battle cry that made Carver laugh out loud, the sound ragged but exhilarating. They resumed the climb, headlights carving tunnels through swirling flurries, and shadows of branches slipped over the windshield like skeletal hands pointing the way forward or warning them back. It was hard to tell which. Dusk blurred the forest into monochrome when the road widened into a clearing crowned by a squat stone structure. The old Firewatch station, 2 stories, windows boarded on the windward side, a forlorn antenna tilting atop the roof. Snowdrifts rose halfway up the shuttered doorway, yet the parking apron was miraculously scoured by wind, revealing cracked asphalt. Carver killed the engine, and the abrupt quiet pressed against their eardrums until they could hear the soft creak of trees adjusting to temperature drop. From the glove box, he retrieved the folder, not to read, but perhaps because its existence dictated the next choice, and slipped it into his coat. Without ceremony, they unloaded supplies, boots crunching over granular snow, and shouldered open the door together, the wood groaning as if surprised by visitors after so many empty seasons. Inside smelled of dust, cold metal, and something faintly resinous, like forgotten pine sap. A cast-iron stove squatted in the corner, rusted but intact. A stack of quarter-split logs lay beside it, snow-free thanks to the eaves. They worked side by side, Carver arranging tinder from a wax-papered bundle he kept in his pack, Calliope cracking ice off the hinges of a shutter to let gray twilight spill into the main room. When the first flame caught and the stove exhaled warm breath, she straightened, sliding off her gloves, and for a moment neither of them moved, the fire's light painting their faces with gold. Unease lingered in corners of the room, strangers, storm, legal knots, but the blaze shaved its edge, replacing it with a mutual awareness that cooperation had carried them safely this far. They unrolled sleeping bags on the creaky mezzanine floor, arranged lanterns and inventoried rations, always speaking in low voices as though the station itself listened. Outside, the wind shifted octave, and an owl called, deep and solitary, across the frozen valley. Calliope opened her notebook to jot observations of tree species and snowpack density. Carver sketched a quick elevation profile of the road ahead, his pencil scratching counterpoint to hers. At length she closed the book, feeling fatigue settle in her bones like silt in quiet water, and looked over the railing to the stove's dull glow below. Tomorrow they would navigate mudslides, petitions, perhaps awkward court questions. Tomorrow the world would resume measuring them by lines on official forms. Tonight, however, they were 2 researchers in borrowed time, warming hands at a resurrected fire in a place where maps blurred and myths waited in the timberline. Calliope tilted her head, listening to the hush between gusts, and wondered if that hush was the sound of the ocean thinking of them. Carver met her questioning gaze, offered a half-smile that carried fatigue, gratitude, and the smallest ember of anticipation, then banked the lantern wick. The room slipped into gentle darkness, stitched by orange threads from the stove, and the storm outside paced the perimeter, respectful for now. In that fragile calm, their accidental union hovered, unexamined but undeniable, like a distant constellation newly charted, yet not yet named, promising navigation once daylight found them again. The first hour after they banked the lanterns passed in, a hush broken only by the stove's intermittent sigh and the brittle crack of pine knots surrendering to heat. Above the firebox, the stovepipe ticked as it expanded, a faint percussion that reminded Calliope of grasshoppers settling for the night. The mezzanine floor, uneven and glossy with decades of beeswax, offered nowhere comfortable to sit except the edge of the loft trapdoor. She and Carver ended up perched there anyway, boots dangling into the warm chimney of air rising from below, shoulders almost brushing when either of them shifted for a better angle. Snow filtered through a high vent like slow-motion confetti, and whenever a gust rattled the shutters, the lamplight trembled across their faces, composing and recomposing their expressions, before either could settle into certainty. Carver worked the tension first, producing a squat thermos he had labeled in Sharpie, Starlight Cocoa, and pouring 2 mugs. The drink tasted of dark chocolate, cayenne, and something floral she could not identify until he admitted it was powdered hibiscus grown in a window box on his research vessel. The unexpected delicacy coaxed a laugh from her that slipped out softer than intended and hung in the air like a question mark. He answered by describing how years at sea had calibrated his culinary creativity. When fresh produce was impossible, spices became calendar entries, each new tin marking the passage of time more vividly than any logbook. His voice stayed low, yet the intimacy of the story, shared in a room otherwise claimed by silence, made Calliope feel as if they were conversing inside the shell of a cathedral. In return, she offered the tale of the first field notebook she ever lost, soaked and shredded in a rainforest cloudburst. She could still recite the vanished data from memory: weights of juvenile quetzals, the percentage of bromeliads hosting dart frog clutches. Proof, she said, that scientific obsession begins not with facts collected, but with facts mourned. Carver listened without the glazed politeness of someone waiting to speak. Instead, his gaze tracked each sentence as though mapping the migration of her thoughts. When she finished, he surprised her by asking what frightened her more: losing data or losing the will to collect it. The honesty of the question, so precisely aimed, startled her into truth. She admitted she feared irrelevance, the moment when the next generation of researchers treated her life's work as antiquated footnotes. The confession tasted bitter, yet uncorking it offered unfamiliar relief, a pressure valve hissing open in her chest. He answered her candor with his own. The scar she had noticed near his ear, he said, was not a boyhood diving mishap but the result of a failed rescue during his first postgraduate expedition. A heavy cable had snapped in a squall, slashing his cheek and pulling a deckhand overboard. They recovered the body at dawn, and no amount of debriefs or revised safety protocols had ever eased the memory of water closing over a friend. Sometimes, when submersible floodlights caught particulate in deep water, the swirl would resemble that storm-tossed night, and his lungs would lock as if history were vacuum sealing him to the moment. He tilted his head, letting the lamplight outline the scar's pale rim, and concluded that he too feared irrelevance, but of a different flavor: the dread that his work might save ecosystems while failing to save the people beside him. The stove popped loudly, and both of them flinched, the vulnerability between them suddenly tangible as the sparks skating up the flue. Calliope set her empty mug on a beam and felt the impulse to close the gap, to touch his hand perhaps, or at least allow her shoulder to rest against his. But inertia can be as powerful as gravity, and instead she asked a smaller, safer question. What music had played at his doctoral celebration? He smiled, rueful and fond at once, describing a drunken sea shanty rendition of Sloop John B. that mislaid 2 verses and gained 3 improvised key changes. The anecdote loosened them both. He asked her favorite field sound, and she spoke of Quetzal dawn choruses and the syncopated drip of fog condensing on leaf tips. They traded auditory memories: the sonar call of beaked whales, the dry whisper of scorpion legs on desert slate, until the conversation curled into comfortable pause. Wind redoubled outside, flogging the shutters, and a sudden downdraft blew smoke rings into the loft. Carver climbed down to adjust the damper. When he returned, he offered her the room's only wool blanket. She tugged a corner around his shoulders in silent invitation, and he accepted, settling beside her so their paired warmth created a microclimate under the coarse fabric. Minutes stretched, stitched by shared heartbeat tempo, neither willing to puncture the quiet. Eventually, Calliope turned her head and found his eyes on her mouth, hesitant but unwavering. The realization sent a flare of heat through her, not quite alarm but proximity's electric cousin. Before doubt could marshal arguments, she bridged the remaining centimeters and kissed him. The kiss began like fieldwork, tentative sampling, careful not to disturb delicate structures. Then, discovering resilience, deepened with researcher enthusiasm. His hand cupped the arc of her jaw, thumb grazing the pulse beneath her ear, and she tasted cocoa and cayenne on his lips, a warmth echoing the stove below. Gravity tilted. For a moment, the loft seemed to rotate around their fused mouths, the rest of the world demoted to background noise. When they finally parted, the air between them crackled with the charge of hypotheses confirmed by unforeseen data. She rested her forehead against his and exhaled, surprised to find her lungs steady rather than fluttering. Neither attempted to label what had happened. Instead, they adjusted the blanket, returned to silence, and let the stove narrate with soft clinks. Snow thickened against the shutters, a dampened drumbeat. After a time, Carver spoke, voice nearly inaudible, confessing that every expedition he had led began with a map, but survived on improvisation. Perhaps, he mused, relationships work the same way. Drawn in pencil, corrected in pen, sometimes inked. Over by storms. Calliope murmured agreement, her own thoughts drifting to the license in his coat pocket downstairs. Ink already dry, lines already drawn. Yet even that permanence felt negotiable now that they had shifted from strangers orbiting a bureaucratic mishap to accomplices exploring the edge of something vast. Fatigue returned with stealthy steps, and when Carver suggested sleep, she found herself reluctant to disentangle, but pragmatism prevailed. They laid sleeping bags side by side, zipping them as close as possible without merging, and left the blanket draped across both as a treaty flag. The lantern dimmed, leaving only stove glow embering the rafters, and in that liminal light she traced the profile of his face, memorizing angles the way she memorized bird silhouettes at dusk. Outside, the wind slowed, gusts smoothing into steady exhalations, and the forest answered with soft avalanches of powder sliding from overloaded branches. Calliope drifted toward dreams, thinking of delayed luminescence, that patient light released after stimulus had ended, and wondered if human hearts harbored similar stores of brightness, waiting for the right disturbance to shine. Somewhere beyond sleep's threshold, she felt Carver's hand find hers between the bags, fingers curling in unspoken reassurance. No vows, no promises, only the mutual decision to keep the connection alive until morning's first questions. The Firewatch Station, guardian of untold storms, witnessed this fragile accord and held its breath. Cedar beams creaking softly, as though aware that a different kind of blaze, quiet, steady, potentially unstoppable, had been lit in the loft that night. Dawn seeped into the Firewatch Station like watercolor through rice paper, pale gold edging along the warped window panes until it found Calliope's eyelashes and coaxed them apart. For a disorienting instant, she thought the furnace of light was the stove gone rogue. But then she remembered the night's slow-building confidences, the cocoa, the scar stories, the kiss that felt as necessary and improbable as oxygen underwater. Frost feathers still decorated the inside of the glass, yet the wind had shifted to a low murmur, and beyond the shutters the forest dripped with the soft ticking of snowmelt. Carver was already up, kneeling by an ancient first-aid chest he must have discovered in some dusty alcove. He looked over when her sleeping bag rustled open and greeted her with the smile of someone relieved to find the previous evening had traveled intact into morning. They shared instant coffee sweetened by pilfered maple sugar packets, then doused the stove and packed with the unspoken coordination born of research teams facing unpredictable field conditions. Outside, the Studebaker stood glazed in a sugar shell of rime, but the sky had cleared to a crystalline blue so stark it seemed freshly minted. Chains clinked as they rolled off the ridge and the tires bit into a roadway newly plowed by county crews who had clearly reached the remote forest during the night. By the time they regained the main highway, the sun sat just above the tree line, turning every icicle on the power lines into a fleeting chandelier. They stopped at a ranger kiosk to inquire about road status, and the attendant confirmed that the landslide detour had reopened only 40 minutes earlier. Carver traced a fingertip over the dashboard map, recalculating. St. Lazarus lay 45 miles south, but the lighthouse at Havanarhu, where his uncle Walcott kept watch over the home family's last coastal outpost, was little more than a sidelong detour if they shaved speed on the coastal shelf road. Calliope had heard him mention the lighthouse when listing possible crash pads for field gear, yet a subtle charge in his voice now suggested the place held weight larger than logistics. She understood enough about wounds, physical and narrative, to sense when one needed tending, so she voted for the detour with a decisive nod. An hour later, the Studebaker crested a headland, and the lighthouse appeared, austere and improbable, like a chess piece abandoned on black basalt. Havanarhu Light was no picturesque candy-striped cylinder. It was a blunt octagonal tower of graying granite, flanked by a keeper's house whose cedar shingles had weathered to the color of gunmetal. The station perched above a scythe of beach strewn with driftwood, and waves hammered the outer rocks in resonant booms that vibrated through the car chassis. Walcott Home waited on the front porch wrapped in a fisherman's sweater so thick it could have served as hull plating. His beard, white and wind-fretted, made him look like an Old Testament prophet who had traded scrolls for tide charts. Yet his eyes flashed mischievous welcome as Carver stepped from the car, and the fierce hug they shared suggested seawater, not blood, carried the stronger family resemblance. Introductions completed, Walcott ushered them inside to an airlock of aromas, kelp broth simmering on a propane range, rope sealant, and a ghostly trace of pipe tobacco embedded in the rafters. The kitchen windows overlooked shoals where foam sketched transient cartographies. If one stared long enough, the foam shapes reassembled into continents of whist and might have been. Over bowls of broth thick with mussels and diced potatoes, Walcott listened while Carver recounted the marriage mishap and ensuing avalanche of logistics. The old man's laughter was more earthquake than chuckle. He slapped the table so hard the enamelware rattled, then wiped his eyes with a sleeve and pronounced the whole saga, exactly the sort of lunacy the home line was built to weather. After lunch, he led them up the narrow stair to the lantern deck. An inland sun flooded the glass, but out on the horizon the sea brewed slate-colored squalls that never quite made shore. Walcott produced a small iron key and unlocked a cedar coffer tucked into a wall niche. Inside lay a stack of brittle letters tied with twine, ink browned by salt air, and atop them, a ring forged from a metal so dark it seemed to absorb light. The keeper's voice dropped until the wind itself leaned closer to hear. These letters belonged to Cornelia Home, Carver's grandmother, the historian whose legend collecting had inspired the Noctiluca Festival. She had written them during the harsh winter of 1963, when her fiancé was lost at sea for 3 weeks before limping home on a storm-shattered schooner. In those pages, she wondered whether the maritime tradition of the glow-tide vows might one day bind someone she loved to a destiny gentler than hers. Walcott passed one unfolded letter to Calliope, gentle as presenting a hatchling. Cornelia's looping script described a dream in which two strange flames, one rust red, one ice blue, swirled together until neither color could be distinguished, and beneath she had penciled a note to her future grandchildren. If ever two souls meet. By storm and waterlight, do not question the cartography of chaos. There are maps older than prudence. The words made something inside Calliope lean forward, like a plant towards sudden sun. She glanced at Carver, who, despite a stoic profile, blinked rapidly as though adjusting to interior weather. The iron ring, Walcott explained, was hammered from a meteorite fragment retrieved by the lighthouse crew after it punched through the north wing roof in 1910. For 3 generations, it had served as a family token, given, never owned, to the person deemed most in need of cosmic orientation. He set the ring in Calliope's palm. It was heavier than it looked, its surface etched with grooves like tiny river deltas, frozen mid-confluence. She tried to protest that such heirlooms should remain in the bloodline, but Walcott waved the objection aside. That bloodline is currently scrambling through paperwork because fate tripped over itself and wrote your name beside my nephew's, he said. Seems to me the universe already stamped your passport. They descended to the keeper's study where a wood stove warded off the damp. Shelves drowned in navigational antiquities, astrolabes, lead line weights, barnacle-encrusted spyglasses. On one wall hung a canvas annotated with glowing tide sightings dating back a century. Colored pins marked each recorded phenomenon. Walcott pointed to the most recent pin, driven in just hours after Calliope and Carver's midnight vows. Cornelia swore the sea archives its own stories, he said. You two just added a chapter, whether you mean to bind the volume or merely footnote it. He left them to explore while he fetched more tea. Alone among relics, Calliope traced the map's pin clusters, feeling the hum of accumulated myth. Carver stood behind her, silent until the weight of his regard pressed gently between her shoulder blades. When she turned, he offered the folded letter Walcott had not yet shown. Cornelia's last entry, composed 3 months before her death. In it, she speculated that love required 2 ingredients, momentum and memory, and that the glow tide's brilliance served to speed the former while branding the latter onto witness minds. Cornelia concluded by daring whatever descendant read her words to choose illumination, no matter how uncharted the waters. Calliope read the passage twice, then met Carver's gaze. Momentum, memory. They had stumbled into momentum on a wave of mistaken identity, but memory, that could be shaped, recorded, curated, something a writer understood intimately. She slid the meteorite ring onto the chain that held her compass pendant, the iron disc settling against her sternum with the gravity of a promise that hadn't yet decided its wording. Carver exhaled a breath that fogged in the cool air, then reached for her hand, neither of them commenting on the symmetry between the ring on her chain and the opal circling her finger. Walcott returned with tea and ginger biscuits, and conversation drifted to mundane logistics. The plow schedule into St. Lazarus, the courthouse's Friday docket, and the spare guest room in the keeper's house should they need a weather delay. Shelter. Yet even the mundane felt resonant beneath the lighthouse lamp, as though each plan forwarded their story along channels older than ink. Before leaving, Calliope asked to photograph Cornelia's letters for archival copying, and Walcott readily agreed, promising to scan the whole collection for her upcoming book. He squeezed her shoulder, grandfatherly yet bracing, and told her the house code if ever she needed a horizon to stand against. Driving away, the Studebaker rolled along a cliff road bathed in late afternoon sun that gleamed off the hood like molten brass. The silence in the cabin was reflective rather than tense, their thoughts busy file sorting the morning's revelations. At length Carver spoke, voice low as tide receding over shingle, admitting he had delayed visiting the lighthouse for months because he hadn't felt worthy of Cornelia's legacy, while his own life bobbed unmoored. Calliope answered that legacies were living organisms. They adapted, mutated, sometimes stowed away inside strangers who carried the next necessary gene. The comment made him laugh, a brief startled sound, and he lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss against metacarpals still chilled from lighthouse stone. They reached the county sign for St. Lazarus just as the sky erupted in sherbet colors, peach, rose, lavender, the fine-grained pastels of an easel left out in rain, and discovered dry, more beautiful for the wash. Streetlights flickered awake along the harbor boulevard, and the courthouse cupola flashed its beacon once in greeting. Tomorrow they would present petitions and maybe unravel the knot the festival had tied. Tonight, however, the meteorite ring warmed softly against her heart, and the opal on her finger gathered the last shards of sunset, pulsing like a second pulse against her own. Beside her, Carver downshifted to coast toward city limits, and the Studebaker's engine note settled into a purr that sounded suspiciously like agreement with Cornelia. Choose illumination. Whatever verdict the judge rendered, whatever signature dried on whatever line, they had already gathered a trove of light, delayed luminescence released at precisely the moment two travelers needed guidance between accident and intention. The morning of the courthouse appointment began in a cheap harborside motel whose wallpaper smelled faintly of limestone and boat varnish, a scent that reminded Calliope of museum specimen drawers, and therefore calmed her more than the most luxurious spa ever could. She woke to the rattle of gulls strafing a dumpster, pulled the curtains aside, and watched fog roll over St. Lazarus's marina in long, translucent fingers that curled around pilings before breaking apart like stage smoke. Carver stood at the sink shaving with a safety razor. He claimed electric models offended the sea by eliminating risk. And when he caught her reflection in the mirror, he smiled through half a face of foam, that lopsided, quietly delighted smile he had started reserving for her alone. They dressed in silence, she in charcoal slacks and a moss-green sweater that gave her hair the intensity of autumn canopy. He in a navy peacoat whose brass buttons gleamed like pocket suns. The blue folder containing their options, petition of annulment and affidavit of confirmation, rested in a messenger bag between their breakfast coffees, its unassuming cardstock weightier than the wrought iron anchor sculpture outside the motel office. The walk to the courthouse followed Harbor Street, where creaky bait shops and artisanal espresso bars coexisted in uneasy truce. Vendors were already setting out display crates of amber-jarred sea urchin roe and hand-thrown pottery glaze to mimic tide pools. One elderly woman, swaddled in shawls the color of wet sand, called out blessings on their marriage before they had a chance to pass. And Carver managed a nod, while Calliope answered with a smile that felt both hopeful and gently provisional. Each casual congratulations tightened the invisible thread that bound them, until by the time they reached the courthouse steps, granite-worn concave by decades of civic footfalls, they moved in pace so synchronized it was impossible to tell who adjusted to whose stride. Inside, the building smelled of lemon oil and old case files, They checked in with a receptionist who stamped visitors' badges that still carried the courthouse's former name, North Coast Territorial Hall, ghost letters peeking through new laminate like submerged fossils. Courtroom B had pew-style benches polished to mirror sheen, and the fluorescent lighting hummed a dull monotone that made Calliope grateful for the warmth of Carver's hand resting between their seats. Judge Plutarch Bain presided from a dais of black walnut, tall and gaunt, his robe draping like smoke around his frame. Yet contrary to his funereal appearance, his eyes danced with alert curiosity, as though every person who walked into his chamber represented a fresh puzzle for his private amusement. He called their case at 9:07, tapping a slender gavel whose sound was more chime than crack, and invited them to the railing with a courtesy that managed to be both courtly and clinical. "Mr. Holm, Mr. Wren," he began, swiveling a fountain pen whose nib glinted scarlet when it caught a beam of sun from the clear-story window. "Your file is already legendary in our intake office. One midnight festival, 2 signatures, and apparently 43,000 views on a live stream that, for legal clarity, I will not watch." A ripple of restrained laughter passed through the handful of spectators, mostly traffic ticket defendants, waiting their turn, and the judge allowed the levity to linger exactly 3 seconds before continuing. "The matter before me is straightforward. Annulment, which erases the marriage in the eyes of the state, or confirmation, which affirms it. Yet the law, bless its earnest limitations, cannot account for that territory between erasure and affirmation where intent evolves after the act. I will therefore ask questions not strictly required, but in my experience, beneficial to all parties' sleep cycles later on." What followed felt less like cross-examination and more like an oral history interview. Judge Bain asked Calliope to recount the moment she realized the room key was wrong. He asked Carver when it dawned on him that the bride before him was unfamiliar. He inquired how they spent the snowbound days afterward, what they had learned about each other, and whether any aspect of their story had been embellished for social media consumption. His tone remained neutral, neither approving nor cynical, but his questions probed deeper layers of intention than Calliope had anticipated, forcing her to articulate the subtle shift from bewilderment to curiosity to cautious attachment. She described the firewatch station, the kiss that had occurred under the watchful hush of old pine beams, and the letter from Cornelia Holm that suggested destiny and accident often wore the same face when glimpsed at night. Carver spoke of meteorite iron warming against Calliope's pulse, of delayed luminescence, of how the sea sometimes stored energy for perfect release in dark hours. At length, the judge set his pen down and folded his hands. "I have no statutory authority over meteorites, folklore, or the private calculus of affection," he said, voice softer now, as though addressing 2 human beings rather than docket numbers. "But I do have authority over the document you signed at 12:07 a.m. and the petition in this folder. I see here," he lifted the blue file, flipping to the last page, "that Ms. Wren has written Calliope Wren Holm in the box designated name after marriage. Mr. Holm, I notice you added a hyphen as well." Carver confirmed with a quiet, "Yes." The judge leaned back, robe pooling like dark water on the chair's oak arms. "Names matter," he mused. "They are the handles by which we pick up stories. Do either of you wish to retract those handles before we proceed?" Calliope inhaled, feeling the air ripple against an answer she had rehearsed all night, yet only now understood. "Your Honor," she began, surprised at how steady her voice sounded, "I came here intending to erase an error, but the last few days have shown me that the only real error is to treat an unexpected event as inherently undesirable. Carver and I may need time, probably warrants, visas of the heart, but I no longer believe annulment reflects our reality. I believe affirmation gives us the chance to choose each other deliberately rather than by accident." Carver added that he preferred the challenge of cultivating something unpredictable to the certainty of stepping away, that life at sea had taught him the value of riding out storms when the compass needle refused to settle. Judge Bain steepled slender fingers, studying them with the faint smile of a chess master who sees a match conclude in unexpected harmony. Then he produced 2 fresh forms: Certificate of Marital Confirmation and Request for 6-month Review. The latter an optional safeguard he offered couples who wish to formalize but retain an avenue for simplified dissolution, if circumstances soured. Calliope read the fine print, heart thudding like a distant drumline. The review clause required mutual appearance in 6 months' time to sign either a reaffirmation or a streamlined dissolution. No fault, no fees. It was, she realized, the legal equivalent of a second peer review round. Gather data, refine hypotheses, publish only when ready. She glanced at Carver, found the same quiet recognition in his eyes, and together they signed. The judge's gavel chimed once more. Very well. By the authority vested in me by the state of Blackstone, I confirm this marriage on a conditional term of 6 months, after which the parties may reaffirm or dissolve. Until that date, you are fully recognized as spouses, with all attendant rights and responsibilities. He stood, robe whispering, and extended his hand first to Calliope, then to Carver. May you navigate the next leg of your voyage with the curiosity that brought you here. Court was adjourned, and the clerk stamped their certificate with a seal that shimmered holographically, an image of the Noctiluca bloom captured in mid-pulse. Dabicharni. Reminder that the county, too, honored luminous phenomena. Outside, the air had warmed to early spring promise, and the fog burned off in layers, revealing fishing boats departing the breakwater like commas released from a long sentence. They walked down the courthouse steps, not so much holding hands as interlacing responsibilities. The document folder now lighter in Calliope's grasp, as though its weight had shifted to her pulse instead. Street musicians had taken up position near the espresso bar, fiddles weaving reels that made seagulls wheel in curious arcs overhead. Carver guided her to a wrought iron bench where they sat absorbing the simple fact that their decision was cloud ink on parchment, waiting to be exposed by whatever sun or storm the next half-year delivered. Neither felt compelled to speak immediately. Some silences deserved reverence rather than filling. When words finally arrived, they came in small, practical parcels. A plan to notify her editor that the residency article had evolved into a book proposal, a promise from him to email his lab crew about adjusted timelines for the Plankton project, a joking debate about whether 6-month anniversaries required cake or merely latitude-longitude coordinates slipped into coat pockets. Yet beneath the logistics hummed an unspoken concord. They would proceed as co-researchers in the experiment of their own future, gathering observations, sharing field notes, and accepting peer review, not only from the judge but from the quiet, measurements of their own hearts. They rose when the fiddle tune modulated into something brisk and wind-bitten, and Carver suggested a celebratory lunch at a harbor cafe renowned for sea lettuce pesto. Calliope agreed, but first she opened the messenger bag, pulled out the meteorite ring from its chain, and placed it on the courthouse railing where sun struck it into a starburst. Orientation complete, she said, and slipped the ring onto her left index finger, the weight now a steady anchor rather than a test. Carver touched the opal band on her fourth finger, their fourth finger, and whispered, "Illumination chosen." Gulls cried overhead like untrained trumpets. The fiddler launched into a triumphant coda, and the harbor wind filled their coats as if urging them forward, down the boulevard, into the next chapter whose lines waited blank, yet humming, luminous even in their invisible ink. Almost 12 months to the night after a misplaced brass key had rewritten their biographies, the town of Ravenhaven, stirred beneath a sky as clear and dark as obsidian. No hurricane-class blizzard raged this time. Instead, the air carried the crisp sweetness that belongs only to late October on that stretch of coast. The seasoned locals called glass water, because when the wind rested, even the outer bays lay flat, enough to mirror constellations without a ripple. In the converted cannery that now served as the Holm and Wren bioluminescent research station, warm light spilled through paned windows and danced across the wharf, painting amber striations on the ropes of 100 curious visitors. The grand opening banner flapped above the door, painted by schoolchildren, dotted with glow-in-the-dark specks that charged each time someone's camera flash went off. And below it, Carver moved from tank to tank explaining how peptide chains inside. His plankton captured and re-emitted energy with waste-free efficiency. He wore a linen shirt rolled to the elbows, lab apron flecked with sea salt crystals, and the same mended navy pea coat whose brass buttons had followed him from courthouse to coastline. Whenever he gestured, the ring of opalescent tidestone flashing on his finger sent stray sparks skittering over glass walls, an unintended marketing ploy far more persuasive than any brochure. Calliope watched from the mezzanine, turning pages of the first public copy of Noctiluca Hearts, how a misplaced key mapped an ocean of light, its linen dust jacket still smelling faintly of fresh glue. Her editor had insisted on a dawn embargo to maximize media buzz, and indeed a small knot of reporters already waited near the stairs for interviews, but she allowed herself a single, greedy minute of private astonishment. The dedication read, "For the stubborn light stored in every unexpected tide," and below it Carver had added in fountain pen blue, a parenthetical, "and for the one who learned to siphon that light into sentences." The gesture made her blush almost as fiercely as the moment 6 months earlier, when seated before Judge Bain for the scheduled review, they had wordlessly extended their hands to re-sign the affirmation clause. Bain had chuckled, said something about predictable unpredictability, and wished them a life of productive peer review. They left the courthouse that day carrying a marriage certificate embossed with the judge's handwritten postscript. Hypothesis accepted for indefinite study. Down on the main floor, the research station's first public demonstration began. Carver dimmed the overheads, and as hush rippled across the hall, technicians poured concentrate of cultured noctiluca into a shallow pool that curved beneath a plexiglass bridge. The liquid swallowed the last ambient photons, then erupted into teal fire as volunteers and waiters stepped gently into the water. Each footprint detonated into a galaxy swirl, and children leaning over the rail squealed, convinced they were watching mermaids trace secret alphabets onto the sea. Calliope descended the stairs in time to escort the governor's tourism liaison across the bridge, explaining how controlled glow tide experiences could replace the ecologically damaging midnight boat chases once marketed to thrill-seeking tourists. The liaison, a pragmatic woman in smart wool, asked tough questions about long-term metabolic stress on the plankton. Carver answered with data sets. Calliope framed them in narrative, and by the time the woman left, she carried a signed memorandum of grant intent and an armful of souvenir jars, miniature ecosystems in stoppered glass, each pulsing like a bottled nebula. Evening tipped toward full dark, and festival bells rang from the newly restored harbor cupola, summoning citizens to the waterline for the anniversary illumination. Calliope slipped out through the side door, heart rattling in her chest with the same thunderous disbelief she had felt the first time a crowd anointed her accidental bride. The pier smelled of cedar planks still damp from afternoon varnish, and paper lanterns bobbed overhead, their saffron innards flickering in the mild breeze. She found Carver already waiting near the rail, collar turned up, cheeks ruddy from brisk coastal air. He opened his coat enough for her to tuck underneath, and for a long moment they simply listened. The creak of hulls at mooring, the distant boom of a surf break, the collective inhalation of a town poised on the threshold of wonder. At precisely 8:30, the municipal lights fell away, and the harbor seemed to disappear, leaving nothing but star-blotted sky above and an infinite black gulf below. Then, as though a switch inside the earth had flipped, the water woke. Ribbons of incandescence unfurled from beneath the docks, surged around pilings, and raced toward the bay mouth where they collided, collaged, and exploded into radiant turquoise. People gasped, some crying out names of loved ones, others simply pointing, their silhouettes caught in silhouette against the living light. Carver pressed his lips to Calliope's temple and whispered the salinity reading, 34.9 practical salinity units, the language of his devotion forever half science, half spell. She replied with a statistic of her own. Pre-orders had pushed the first print run of her book into 4th place on the regional bestseller list. He laughed, exhilarated, then reached into his coat and produced a palm-sized compass carved from driftwood, its needle replaced by a sliver of polished meteorite metal. "In case we ever misplace another key," he said, slipping the cord around her neck beside the original iron ring. "At least one of our maps will point to home." A brass band on the barge struck up a procession tune, a waltz repurposed from last year's chaotic march, and the crowd began to sway, a living tide dancing beside the luminous one. Calliope and Carver joined, unself-conscious now, moving with the easy confidence of two people who had both rehearsed and improvised the steps for a full year. She caught glimpses of familiar faces. Evlampia McBride waving a tray of hot toddies from the inn's pop-up stand, Uncle Walcott beside the Lighthouse Society delegation, wiping mist from his spectacles while claiming the credit was all in the meteorite, Judge Bain on a civic guest dais, nodding approval like a conductor satisfied the orchestra had found the proper tempo. Overhead, a waxing moon lit the scene in silver, but its light felt secondary to the blue fire rippling beneath their feet. As the waltz resolved into a held final chord, fireworks cracked open above the breakwater, a flurry of white chrysanthemum bursts, followed by a cascade of emerald comet tails that fizzled just shy of the water's surface. Each impact seeded concentric rings of planktonic glow, artificial stars meeting biological constellations in collaborative art. Carver twirled Calliope once more, then drew her close, his breath warm against her hair. He spoke not of vows or forever. They had learned those words could collapse under their own mass, but of tomorrow's tide tables, of a dawn plankton sampling run, of the lunchbox sandwiches he would pack with extra slices of ship-deck tomato, because he knew she liked the salt bloom that crystallized on the skins. She answered with plans for a children's edition of the book, pages that would fold out in ultraviolet responsive ink, so young readers could watch hidden creatures come alive under blacklight flashlights. Midnight neared, though no one announced it. Instead, a gentle hush fell as the band faded and townsfolk lit handheld sparklers. Calliope raised hers, tracing an infinity loop that glimmered briefly before vanishing into the salt-laden night. Carver copied the motion, and their glowing figures intertwined for an instant. Two mirrored lemniscates, a mathematician's symbol of boundless continuation. She felt again that flicker of awe at how quickly chaos had become compass. How a single misprinted room number had expanded into laboratories, books, and a shared lexicon of phenomena only they could name. The opal on her finger answered the harbor's radiance with its own inner tide, and the meteorite shard at her throat hummed against her heartbeat, as if Earth and cosmos were exchanging quiet congratulations. When the sparklers burned out, they kissed, not urgently, not possessively, but with the calm depth of researchers confirming results already peer-reviewed by time. Around them, applause rose, echoing off the water, and lanterns ascended skyward, first dozens, then hundreds, carrying handwritten promises into upper winds. Some soared, others faltered and drifted into the sea, where bioluminescence greeted them like old friends returning home. Calliope watched one lantern tumble gently into the harbor, its candle extinguished but its message intact, the paper floating in a pool of blue light. She wondered if the sea would read that message, store its energy, and release it later for someone else to follow, the way it had stored theirs. Long after the crowd thinned, after the cleanup crews rolled bins down the pier, and the band packed away their brass, Calliope and Carver remained at the rail. In the hush that follows celebration, they held each other and listened to the harbor breathe. Pulses synced to the slow surge of glow below. Tomorrow would bring grant proposals, supply orders, editorial deadlines, and inevitably new storms, literal or metaphorical. Yet tonight, the map older than Prudence, the one Cornelia Holm had glimpsed in Dreamscript ink, lay unrolled before them in living color. They traced its roots with steady fingers, and wherever their touch fell, the water answered, flaring bright as memory, bright as momentum, bright as a life chosen each day like a lantern lifted into winter sky, illuminating everything it could, before drifting gently, inexorably toward the next wonder.